Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Today's OP wrote a great story for people who don't know anything about concrete. Also, customers can be incredibly stupid and simply don't understand anything about how it all works. When we say it's not pumpable, that means it won't work with the pump. I'm a truck driver. More specifically, I drive a concrete mixer. That means a large part of my job is dealing with people who know nothing about the material, nothing about my equipment, but still think they know better than me, since I'm obviously just an evil-smelling, gap-toothed hillbilly who didn't graduate high school. So on this particular day, I was pouring at a school out in the middle of nowhere. Our plant was the closest one to the job site, but it was still half an hour away. It was also over 110 degrees. Schools usually do their renovation and repair work in the summer. The order indicated that they were going to use a concrete pump, and the manager, we'll call him Bob, told me to throw in some fiber. There are a few different kinds of fiber we use, but the only one that works with the trailer pump consists of small squares woven out of a cotton-like material that come apart in the mix. I throw that in because it's a pump job. So we get to the job site and start pumping. Everything's going well for the first couple of yards. Then the pump's reducer, a pipe running across the front of the pump, snaps, swings out, and slams into my foot. I wasn't hurt, but it turned out the pumper knew the pipe was getting thin and ran with it anyways. Now I'm pissed. Those pumps operate at massive pressures, and I've seen them blow concrete hard enough to knock a man over 20 feet away. If I hadn't been wearing steel toes, it very well might have broken something. Eventually, the customer comes over to see what the problem is. He looks down at the pile of concrete, dripping out the broken pipe, prods it with his foot, and asks, "Where is the fiber we ordered?" I explain that the Buckeye fiber can't be seen after it mixes into the concrete, but assure him that I added it personally. He then starts yelling at me. He didn't order Buckeye fiber, he ordered plastic fibers. He pulls out his paperwork, and sure enough, that's what he ordered. I admit it was a mistake, but I also tell him that the fibers he ordered won't work with the pump he's using. The inspector tries to explain that what he got is as good or better than what he ordered, and he's willing to sign off on the change. Customer isn't hearing any of it. We finish the load, and the customer orders another 10 yards. I call it in, adding the bit about the broken pipe and that the customer was upset that the first load had Buckeye in it instead of plastic fiber. Bob can hear the guy swearing at me over the radio. Now, Bob tends to be very protective of his drivers. He's also more than willing to let customers hang themselves with their own lack of knowledge. I once watched him batch about $1,400 of liquid stupid because a customer ordered concrete with both an accelerator and a retardant in it. Bob could have loaded another truck right then and there and shipped it out. Instead, he noted that only one truck was scheduled for that job and waited for me to drive the half hour back to the plant. Then he batched the load with plastic fibers and brought the ticket down personally. As he handed me the ticket, he said, "Don't forget they ordered a 4-inch slump." Concrete slump is a measure of how wet it is. It's measured by packing it into a 12-inch tall cone, setting it on the ground, pulling the cone off, and checking how far the pile of concrete dropped, slumped. 4 inches is something of a default order, but the only things you pour that dry are footings and curbs, and you don't put that dry into a trailer pump. So I load up and drive back to the job. By now, they've been sitting out there for over an hour in 110-degree heat. The pumper's panicking because the concrete's setting inside his pump, and the patch of sidewalk they're doing is going to have a great big cold joint. Fresh concrete poured against set concrete makes a weak joint that's more likely to crack down the middle of it. As soon as the concrete reaches the back of the drum, the pumper tells me to stop and add a bunch of water. The inspector authorizes 10 gallons. It's still drier than the pumper wants, but the inspector won't allow more. Then the concrete hits the pump's grate. Everything's fine for a couple seconds, then it just starts piling up without going through. All those plastic fibers were getting caught on the grating and clogging it up. The gravel can't get through with the fiber blocking things up, so all that's getting pumped is cement and water. Customer comes out furious. He accuses Bob of spiking the load with extra fiber and tries to reject the load. I point out that we warned him the load would not be pumpable, and besides that by having me add water to the load, they've already bought it. So now we're pumping a few seconds, clearing the grate, then pumping a little more. It took about 3 hours, which translated into about $300 of standby charges. Most of the fiber didn't go through the pump. The pumper didn't want me throwing the giant clots of plastic in his hopper, along with quite a bit of the gravel. The inspector ended up taking a couple samples from the pump hose. Normally, they only sample at the truck chute because he knew what was going into the form wasn't what was coming out of my truck. A month later, when those extra samples failed their 28-day test, the school had to tear out that sidewalk and redo the whole thing. This time they ordered it with Buckeye fibers. Well, for an evil-smelling, gap-toothed hillbilly who didn't graduate high school, you wrote this story very, very well. Props to your skills. Great story. Give the man what he wants. Sometimes you have to let him learn the hard way. Glad you didn't get injured. And our second story. Revenge on the IT manager. This happened a few years ago, and by a few I mean a lot. I was a student in the mid-'80s, and I got a job for the summer working for a major electronics company. It was low-skill, boring grunt work, but it was a foot in the door and paid good money. I worked in the IT department next to a very noisy room filled with a very wide dot matrix printer that buzzed and chattered all day long. It was the central printer room for the VAX system that we used back then. One of my jobs was to take the huge fan-fold printout. Each stack was about 2 by 1 feet and about a foot high, and separated into individual print jobs, lay them on a table for people to pick up, and also to refill the printer with new paper. The noise drove me nuts, so I closed the door. The IT manager found out and insisted that the door stay open so that I could hear when a printer was out of paper. The printer gave out a series of beeps when the paper had run out. Let's just call him Jerk, a real petty tyrant. In a nearby room was Bob. Bob was an odd guy. He was an absolute hippie, a relic from the 60s. Bob was a slacker. He appeared to do the minimum work necessary to stay employed, but he was also a genius, a hobby electronics experimenter, proper old-school coder, COBOL and Fortran, radio amateur. He wrote for electronics magazines, designed and built his own computers, radios, and hi-fi gear. He would happily fix any electronics you brought him and refuse payment, and he was the go-to person for almost anyone in the company with a technical problem. The odder the problem, the better he liked it. Senior engineers would come down to Bob with a question and go away with an answer. Sometimes he was seconded to a project to consult, and on more than one occasion co-authored a technical paper and was named on a patent or two. Most of the time, Bob didn't want any recognition or fuss, but usually you got to hear through the grapevine that it was his work. He liked his little room and liked to be his own boss. I liked Bob. He was a genuinely nice guy. He had a lot of power in the company, threw a lot of favors, but never wielded it. He was always helpful to anyone who asked, from MD to summer students like me. In fact, he really liked students and often mentored us when we had a problem or just taught us how to work the system. I told Bob about the noise in passing. Bob went away and designed a remote out-of-paper system that would indicate a paper outage on a light board where I sat. He didn't have to, but Bob liked the problem to work on. Jerk rejected it out of hand. I resigned myself to a summer of noise, but Bob just quietly turned to a new solution. Bob proposed an improvement to the printing system to Jerk. The print header was a line of hash symbols, the print job name, the username of the person who printed it, and another line of hash symbols. Sometimes you could pick up on the hash symbols, sometimes not. It was hit or miss. Bob had experimented with a mix of text and ASC2 block characters and came up with a distinctive song that the printers could make by printing apparent gibberish. Based on his amateur radio experience, he theorized that even someone untutored in Morse can recognize a Morse code phrase very quickly, and the ear picks up on the phrase even when not actively listening, and so someone could pick up on a distinctive tune or rhythm. He ran a test and it worked. Jerk could see the benefits and so authorized Bob to code it into the standard print footer. In production, I could hear the end of every print job as the printer changed, its random screeching buzz to the distinctive sounds, and I pulled them off the printer as they finished instead of the finished paper stack, speeding up the print job process and reducing the wait time for those waiting on the job. Jerk was nominated for an Innovation Award, about a 200-pound bonus, and accepted without acknowledging Bob. Bob didn't care, and neither did I. After my ear had tuned in, Bob gave me a Morse alphabet and just smiled at me. He had coded symbols for 2 lines at the end of the print that sounded like F-U-K, jerk, in Morse code. It didn't reduce the noise, but it made it bearable that every print job was an insult. It also made me happy that there were a few radio amateurs in the company who all knew Morse, and they all knew Bob, so I guess he told them. When they came to the print pickup point, you could see some of them catch the phrase and smile. Sometimes it's the petty revenges that mean the most. I rejoined the company after I graduated 3 years later. Bob had medically retired after a massive heart attack and died shortly after. Jerk had moved on, and we were beginning to move to the massive computing power of desktop 386 PCS with local printers instead of the VAX system. But I went down to the print room one day to hear FUK jerk over and over. It made me so happy. I may have shed a little tear at that moment in memory of Bob. I think it's a general rule, do not mess with engineering or IT, or people who serve you food for that matter. Long live the memory of Bob. Have you ever thought about finding Jerk out there on the internet and telling him this story? Maybe he'd laugh about it all these years later. And our last story. They tried to force me to join an HOA. We bought a house in 2015. We never paid any HOA fees, was not mentioned when we bought the house, and after asking the neighbors, they said one didn't exist. Then this past month, I got a letter saying that a HOA needs to be formed to pay for maintenance of a strip of lawn next to a road and a traffic circle. The fee is $300 a year. The fee isn't an issue, but I don't want to be subjected to all the ticky-tacky rules, plus these things sound like scams. The thing that's unclear is whether the HOA existed in the first place or not. When I bought the home, it wasn't in any of the closing documents, but I did get a binder they provided by the developer to the original homeowner when the house was built in 2010. The developer's trying to start the HOA, saying that an HOA did exist and had some rules. Just about everyone on my street would be breaking some rule, as I would be as well. My guess is there was one in the beginning, but it was never enforced until now. The letter states I have until July 30th, then they'll put a lien on the house. Anyway, I already made some phone calls to lawyers. Lawyers were consulted, and it felt like I was gearing up for a battle I never signed up for when I bought the house. But hey, I'm not one to back down without a fight. I started digging through the paperwork, old records, and that mysterious binder from the developer. It was like detective work, trying to uncover the truth about whether this HOA was a real deal or just a sudden money-grabbing scheme. Then a breakthrough. It was an old agreement that stated the HOA was dissolved years ago due to lack of interest and participation. The lawyers were ready, the paperwork was in order, and we were not backing down. In the end, the HOA backed off. They realized they were dealing with a community that wasn't willing to be pushed around. The legal battle was averted, and we emerged victorious. No liens, no ticky-tacky rules, just the sweet taste of triumph. And as for me, well, I became the local legend who faced down the HOA and lived to tell the tale. Sometimes you just have to fight for your right to a lawn free from the HOA drama. It's terrifying when an HOA tries to invade your life. It's very good that our OP was able to unravel the mysterious origins of this alleged HOA. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.